Hello, everyone. If you want to understand how power works in 2026, don't start with speeches. Start with the image. President Donald Trump has posted photos that appear to show Venezuela's leader, Nicolas Maduro, in handcuffs. Major news organizations report that Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, were seized in Caracas in a U.S. operation, flown to the United States, and brought to a federal court in New York, where they pleaded not guilty to drug and weapons-related charges. I'm using careful language for a reason. Caracas disputes Washington's version. Lawyers are expected to challenge the legality of the capture, and the information war will run for weeks. But even while details are contested, the strategic meaning is already visible. This was designed as a public demonstration of method. It says, we can act fast, reach far, and turn the result into a message. One clarification before we go further. This is not an endorsement of Maduro, and it is not applause for Trump. I'm looking at what this episode says about the international system, how law and force are increasingly fused, how precedent replaces negotiated rules, and how a dramatic move can reshape the calculations of rivals and partners. So what exactly is the message? There are three layers: domestic politics, regional control, and global signaling. Domestically, the U.S. story is framed as law enforcement and national security. The accusations revolve around large-scale cocaine trafficking and organized criminal conspiracy. That framing matters because it gives Washington political cover. It is easier to sell a criminal case than to openly sell regime change, and it is easier to justify speed when the argument is public safety. Regionally, Venezuela sits on a pressure point that directly touches U.S. interests. It influences migration flows across the hemisphere. It affects energy markets, especially heavy crude that certain refineries depend on. And it has been a place where U.S. rivals, Russia, Iran, and China, have tried to show that Washington does not have uncontested dominance even in its own neighborhood. Globally, the message is simple. Speed is a weapon. Create a new reality quickly, and you gain the initiative. Everyone else spends weeks debating legality and what should happen next, while the fact on the ground hardens. In the modern media environment, the first mover often owns the narrative, and the narrative shapes the diplomacy. Now, why do analysts immediately say this is a signal to Russia, Iran, and China? Start with Russia. For Moscow, Venezuela has been symbolic. It was proof that Russia can appear in the Western Hemisphere and complicate U.S. freedom of action near America's front yard. Not necessarily with massive forces, but with presence, diplomacy, arms ties, security cooperation, and the psychological effect of being there. If Washington can reach into Caracas, remove the top figure, and present him in a U.S. courtroom, that symbolism takes a hit. Russia can condemn the move. The main point has already been delivered. There is a second, quieter point Moscow will notice. Partners matter only if you can protect them when the moment turns. When a high-profile partner falls fast, other partners start asking uncomfortable questions about guarantees, deterrence, and distance. That is how influence erodes, not through a speech, but through an inability to prevent a decisive move. Now, Iran. Iran's ties with Venezuela have been practical, not just ideological. Countries under sanctions look for workarounds, trade routes, logistics channels, technical support, and political cover that says, you are not isolated. Venezuela has offered Iran a friendly platform in the Americas, closer to U.S. territory than Tehran normally operates. If Caracas becomes unstable or shifts toward Washington, Iran loses a useful partner and receives a blunt reminder that the U.S. can bundle force, legal framing, and media spectacle in a single package. And that tends to change behavior. When leaders feel personally exposed, they tighten internal control, raise the cost of dissent, and lean harder on proxy tools abroad. Because direct confrontation with the United States is expensive, while indirect pressure is easier to deny. Now, China. China's core advantage is predictability, long contracts, stable repayment, and influence through investment. Sudden political rupture creates contract risk, debts, supply agreements, and the reliability of partners who can be replaced quickly. For Beijing, this is less about ideology and more about uncertainty. Chaos becomes a tax on strategy, and China dislikes paying that tax. But there is a wider audience than those three capitals. Every sanction elite and every regime that lives on gray channels is watching. The belief that leaders are personally untouchable looks weaker. When that belief weakens, behavior changes. More repression at home, thicker personal security, more paranoia, and more brittle decision-making. Brittle systems crack under stress, and that is how crises escalate. Now let's talk about the lever that makes Venezuela strategically important: oil. Venezuela has enormous reserves and produces heavy crude that matters for specific refineries and trading routes. If Washington supports a transition in Caracas, sanctions relief becomes an obvious tool. Lift restrictions in exchange for cooperation, elections, and security guarantees. Markets don't wait for barrels to arrive. They price expectations. If traders believe Venezuelan output can rise while other producers maintain high supply, prices can face downward pressure. For Americans, that links to gasoline prices and inflation. If supply expectations rise, pump pressure can ease. But if instability spreads, sabotage, strikes, fighting among factions, risk premiums can rise and push prices the other way. The energy effect depends on whether Venezuela stabilizes fast enough to be an oil story, not a chaos story. This is where the Russia connection becomes economic, not rhetorical. Russia remains heavily dependent on energy revenue. Lower prices and tougher competition squeeze hard currency inflows. That does not end a war overnight, but it tightens the budget math and reduces room for maneuver over time. In long conflicts, money is stamina. Now, the hard part: what happens inside Venezuela after the headline fades? Capturing a leader can be fast. Building a stable political outcome is the difficult part. Venezuela has security forces, party structures, and loyalist networks with their own interests. Reports already point to street mobilization by regime supporters, while interim authorities signal interest in a working relationship with Washington. When you see anger and outreach at the same time, it usually means factions are trying to survive, buy time, and negotiate from whatever leverage they still have. So the next phase is a contest over institutions. Who controls the armed forces, key infrastructure, and the oil system? Who can claim legitimacy? And who can prevent fragmentation? If Washington wants a strategic win, it needs more than an image. It needs a governing structure that can hold the country together and keep basic services and the oil sector running. If that fails, the episode risks becoming another dramatic demonstration followed by a long period of instability, resentment, and retaliation. This is also where the legality debate becomes more than academic. Critics argue that cross-border capture normalizes power grabs and sets a precedent others will copy. Supporters argue that transnational criminal networks can't hide behind sovereignty when they target U.S. society. Whatever your view, the precedent effect is unavoidable. If extraction plus prosecution becomes a standard tool, other powers will either copy it or harden against it. Both outcomes make the world more confrontational. So what should you watch next? First, control, not rhetoric. Who holds Caracas in practice? Security services, airports, ports, and oil infrastructure. Second, sanctions terms. If Washington wants stability and supply, it will define conditions for relief quickly and clearly, and it will likely tie them to concrete steps from the new authorities. Third, responses in practice, not statements. Retaliation can show up through cyber pressure, proxies, diplomatic obstruction, or energy coordination elsewhere. Let me close with a simple takeaway. Whether you love this operation or hate it, it signals that the United States is willing to use speed, force, and public spectacle to reshape realities in its hemisphere. The ripple will move through oil markets, sanctions politics, and the strategic calculations of Russia, Iran, and China. And it will shape the future because once a precedent is set, others will test it. Thanks for watching. If this analysis helps you see the larger map, like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments. Does this mark the beginning of an era of extraction diplomacy, Or does blowback push Washington back toward quieter tools, starting now, in real time, today?